In this demo, I want to talk a little bit about testing. And in particular, I want to talk about testing Sequelize models because this is really something that will not only help out your development, but also it's really a skill that I think is really important. Um, and let's get started. There's a couple of modules that we're going to need. We know that we're going to use Sequelize here because that's what we want to test out. So I'm going to install Sequelize in Postgres. Let me actually just do an npm init real fast. I don't have anything in this directory. It's empty. So let's do npm init, and I'm going to install Sequelize and Postgres, and that's going to automatically get saved in my package.json. I'm going to do this with a minimal number of files. We're not going to be testing out Express. We're just going to basically be testing out our data layer, or at least getting our testing set up. There's a couple of things we need to do. We're going to need to have a file where our tests are going to end up running. And I'm just going to touch a file. I'm going to call it spec.js. Now, eventually, we're going to have more than one file that has tests, and we'll have to maybe think about how we end up finding all those files. Maybe we'll put them in another directory. But for now, this is going to end up being fine. Let me also touch where my code is going to be, which is going to be db.js. So my spec file is going to have my test. It's going to end up pulling in whatever it needs from my DB module to test out, and it's going to end up running its test. Well, what does that mean by running tests? Well, there are testing frameworks that are available out there. There's a number of them. And one of the more popular ones for server-side code is called Mocha. And so I'm going to do an npm install of two libraries, Mocha and Chai. Mocha is the testing framework, and I'll point out where Mocha ends up getting used. And Chai is what we would call an assertion library that allows us to write our assertions. And that's really all tests are. Tests are just basically a way of saying, hey, look, this is what my code should do. And if it does that, great, your tests pass. If it doesn't, your tests end up failing, and then you fix your code, so your tests end up passing. The only thing I'm going to do here is that I don't need this to deploy my application. Everything else I'm going to need to deploy. So here I'm going to do a save dev. And if you looked at your package.json, you would see that this would go into a sort of a separate area in the package.json. Not critical, but also shows that you understand a little bit about dependencies if you end up doing it this way. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up my package.json in my editor of choice, and I'm going to go over here, and in my package.json, I'm going to get rid of this test, and I'm going to put a test dev. And for my test dev, what I'm going to end up doing is I'm going to say, hey, look, Mocha. So Mocha was installed. We can see we've got a Mocha dependency here. So Mocha is installed for this project. And I'm going to specify, hey, Mocha, I want you to run the spec.js test. And by the way, as I make changes, I want you to end up watching it. That's a flag that you could send to Mocha. So if I do npm run test dev, it'll end up looking at my test. Of course, I don't have any tests. So I'm going to write a quick test. And the test that I'm going to end up running, I'm going to write a describe. So this is a method that comes from Mocha. And Mocha is what's loading this code. And I'm going to say I'm going to describe my application. All right. Eventually, this is going to get broken up into several different files. But for the moment, let's just put it in one file. And we have the ability to nest describe blocks. And I'm going to put another describe block, and I'm going to say I want to describe my data layer. And I'm going to run one more thing here. I'm going to say I'm going to seed my user model. So I'm going to describe user model. And one of the things that you want to do with testing, especially databases, is to have some data in there that you could end up testing. And I'm going for my model. I'm going to say there are 3 users. Again, this is something that we could always end up changing. But once I end up doing this, and I have the describe and the its, so the its basically specify within the it block, you could write your expectations. If there's no it methods or it blocks, there really aren't going to be any tests. And describe is just a way of organizing tests. So I could also describe my routes and put that somewhere else, or I could describe multiple models and do that. And sometimes Mocha doesn't pick up those changes for whatever reason, but here you're seeing that my test passed, which doesn't make a little much sense. Here's my describe, and here's my it block. So Mocha is a testing library that can run your tests, and Chai is an expectation library. So Chai has a method called expect, and I could get it from requiring Chai. And I'm going to write an expectation. I'm going to say I expect users.length to equal 3. And I'm going to go back here, and it'll say, well, this is a problem because users is not defined. And let's fake it here. I'm just going to say users equals an empty array, right? Now it fails for a different reason. Well, what I really want to do here is I want to bring in my DB model. So I'm going to say DB equals require /DB. And within my DB model, before every test, and this is common for any for an application, is to put in a before each. And in the before each, if this is a anything that's asynchronous, nothing else will run before this before each ends up completing. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to be optimistic and say DB has a sync and seed method that I'm going to end up calling. And this is going to break on a number of accounts because DB sync and seed is not a function. And let's go and create the DB sync and seed. So I'm going to jump ahead a little bit by actually bringing in some of the things that we're going to use here. We're going to use Sequelize. We're going to create a connection, and this is going to be new Sequelize. And again, I always do this because I want to deploy it. And I also would actually have another database URL for my testing. But for now, let's just do this. And this is going to be Postgres. Let me make up a database name, localhost, let's say profs testing demo DB. All right, pretty sure this database doesn't exist. And for my sync and seed, it's going to be a function, and I'm going to make it asynchronous. So let me put async in front of this. And again, no matter what you end up putting in a file, if you want to use it outside the file, you have to export it. And so we'll do module exports, and we'll export sync and seed. Now, if I end up running this, this is fine, this method exists, but again, I don't have any users. Well, what do I really want sync and seed to do? I want to await, and I want to say to my connection, I want you to sync, force, true. And this is fine as you're doing your development. We'll find out that eventually you're not going to want to wipe out your database. For now, it's fine. This is a database that doesn't exist. Let's create it. Now that database should exist. Okay, so I don't see that error anymore, but let's actually go and create a model. We'll do a real simple model. This is going to be const user equals con.define user, and we're just going to put a name here. This is going to be a Sequelize string. And in here, I'm just going to put a const here with names, and this is going to be Mo, Larry, and Curly. And we'll specify that we're going to await, and we'll say names.map, and this is going to give us an array of promises. So we're going to say promise.all, names.map. For each name, we're going to specify user create this name. And so now let's run that. Okay? And again, we're still failing our test, but now really what we can end up doing with our spec is that instead of getting users this way, we could say this is going to be asynchronous. Again, anything dealing with database or accessing an outside resource is always going to be asynchronous, and you're going to have the words async and await. And for our users, we're going to await, and we're going to say user find all. Now, again, we don't have our users here, so it'll say user is not defined, but let's be optimistic here, and we'll say that we're going to get our user from db.models. I always like to set it up this way. And we'll go over here and we'll specify that our models are going to be user. And now we could see that we end up passing the test. We could write some additional tests, make sure that the users are named Mo. We could also, ensure that the names are, getting added. One thing that the tests give us is that we could end up, refactoring our code. And it's a nice indication if our tests were set up correctly and they don't break, that any refactoring is going to end up working. I could also go over here and do things like, allow null, false, right? And I'll still end up passing, and all kinds of other things that we could end up putting in our test. But just, again, real quick introduction to this. Really 3 files that we're dealing with: our package.json, our spec file, and our database. And again, this is really a great way to set up all the functionality that you need to have in your data layer. And then you're going to be pretty confident that if you end up making changes in the data layer and refactoring code, that your code is going to still end up working. So it's a real easy way to get your development started with a project.